Hello and welcome to Drawing from Memory. Thank you for getting here first thing in the day and for choosing our panel out of the many wonderful options. I'd also like to thank the Center for Jewish History for hosting the Jewish Comics Experience, and of course our panelists for bringing their expertise today. If you're here, it's because you already know about the Jewish origins and tradition of comics. Today, the Leo Baeck Institute, a partner of the center, is proud to present a conversation about using the graphic medium to engage with stories of Jewish history and understanding Jewish positionality in the context of this history and our present-day politics and social landscape. Leo Baeck Institute is a research library and archive dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of German-speaking Jewry. Our extensive library, archive, and art collection houses materials from the Middle Ages to the present. The book that is the subject of our panel today, Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz, was partially researched in our archive. After author Ari Richter generously donated his great-grandfather Richard May's papers, including May's autobiography, he spent some time with our team translating the papers and conducting further research on the historical puzzle pieces that make up the story of the Richter and May families. When reading the memoir, I was struck by Richter's firm grasp on both the past and the present, as he weaves his relatives' experience in rising fascism through his evolving understanding of his own Jewishness. Today, Richter will dialogue with Professor Amy Hungerford about the memoir. Amy Hungerford is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University and the Ruth Fulton Benedict Professor of American Literature. Her first two books explore literary engagements with genocide and religion in the 20th century. And her most recent book, Making Literature Now, deals with the way social networks shape the choices of contemporary writers and readers. She is also one of the founding members of Post 45, one of the first collectives for scholars working in post-1945 literary and cultural studies. Ari Richter is a visual artist and comics creator. He is currently a professor of fine arts at LaGuardia Community College in the City University of New York. Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz is his first book. He has received fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. And his work has been exhibited at a long list of institutions, including the Skirball Cultural Center, the National Museum of American Jewish History, and the Celebrate Brooklyn Festival. After the talk, there will be time for a short Q&A, and you can buy the memoir at the signing downstairs in the Great Hall. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks, Stephanie. Ari, it's so delightful to be here with you today. Could you just walk us through the book? Because I think probably not everyone here has read it yet. Hopefully you will do so soon. But this will kind of bring it all to mind, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure thing, Amy. And thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. And hi again, I'm Ari Richter, and I will start with a brief overview of the book. This is the cover, Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz, a graphic family memoir of trauma and inheritance. So I worked on this book for about 5 years, researching in part at the Leo Baeck Institute, as Stephanie had pointed out. The book follows my family's history before, during, and post the Holocaust. 3 of my 4 grandparents were German Jews who all escaped Germany in 1939 on their own, sort of like incredible trajectories. This illustration here is what the book's cover is derived from. And you see this family tree at the top, like a literal translation of my family tree, that you then go down to the root system of this kind of history of Jewish trauma in this case. So the 20th century, the Holocaust, the pogroms of the 19th century, and then various expulsions, massacres, inquisitions, ghettoizations, as it goes down that root system. And so the book is split into 3 sections. The first section is really my experience growing up as an American Jew in Florida, in kind of red state, Central Florida, as I grew up there. And each chapter is sort of coded differently aesthetically. We'll talk about this, I know, a little bit later, but this one's a lot airier and more kind of based on like the Sunday Funnies aesthetic. And it's more humorous. It's got more humorous coding here, and it just describes the type of Florida landscape that I grew up in, less the Boca Boobies and South Beach sophisticates that us New Yorkers may be familiar with. I grew up where essentially, really assimilation was a key principle of my upbringing, as it was for my parents, as it was for my grandparents in Germany and my great grandparents, the generations before. So we really had this project of, trying to find our rooting in American culture, specifically, like white American culture, and really finding that, that place of belonging, that we are just the same as our other, cohort, our other American cohort. Then in where this part of the book kind of takes a shift is the Tree of Life shooting in 2018, which was really an inflection point personally, as I know it was for American Jews or at large, but it was also became the inception point of this book. So it was the point where I really got to see myself as others potentially saw me as the other. As much as I'd grown up trying to distance myself from this, this Jewish identity as the central point of relation to myself. So I started researching through my family archives, which was pretty extensive. I had, as I said, 3 German Jewish grandparents who were Holocaust refugees and survivors, as well as great grandparents who wrote down their stories. So I had this huge corpus of information to start from, first-person testimonies that described very different experiences. The cosmopolitan experience of my family from the sort of urban centers of Stuttgart, Breslau, and Berlin, and then the hardscrabble existence of my family in Germany's rural Southwest. And I started a project of just illustrating these stories, not without an idea in mind of making a book, but just to visualize what these experiences were and try to put myself in their shoes. So here's, me literally looking in the mirror and seeing the reflection of my great grandfather, Richard May in this case, whose story then opens up the second third of the book, which are my ancestor narratives that I illustrate. The first one being my great-grandfather, Richard May, a textile broker in Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, but Breslau, Germany, pre-war. And he was arrested on Kristallnacht. He was rounded up in a cattle car and, abused in all these ways, witnessed abuse in many other ways in the concentration camp Buchenwald. And that's where he narrates his own experience. I won't dwell too long on the incredibly violent imagery here, but that you'll see that there's the actual narration is taken directly from his first person testimonies that he wrote on the quote onion skin paper that he typewrote it in the late 1940s before his own untimely death. After surviving the war. And the next set of ancestor testimonies, my paternal grandparents, Karl and Ruth Richter, Rabbi Karl and Ruth Richter, who met at the Breslau Theological Seminary. Ruth was the daughter of one of the trustees, who happened to be Richard May from the previous chapter, and Karl was a young rabbinical student from Stuttgart who was studying there. They fell in love. And then they got married and oversaw a number of small congregations throughout Germany until Kristallnacht, when their congregation in Mannheim was dynamited by the local Nazis, and Karl had to go into hiding. So he was first hidden at the Jewish hospital in Mannheim in the infectious diseases ward, and then in some family friends' home in Stuttgart. He was sort of smuggled over the border to Stuttgart and lived in an attic while and these are non-Jewish friends, while the nephew, who was a Nazi stormtrooper, kind of came and went unknowing of his location there. And then they eventually got a non-quota visa to the U.S. Because for his clergy status. There was a visa just for clergy, and ironically, they got it at the embassy on Hitler's birthday, his 50th birthday celebration. The embassy was closed, and they had to come back the next day because of the birthday celebration, but got themselves out. The final of the ancestor narratives, my maternal grandfather, Jack Honig, who grew up in rural southwestern Rhineland-Pfalz, Germany, and his experience was much different. He was much less incorporated into the general society. He was more kind of bullied, as as a Jewish person growing up there, a very hard scrabble existence for him. And he was also arrested on Kristallnacht as a teenager, 16-year-old, and interned in Dachau, and suffered all the indignities and the cruelties there that we're kind of familiar with these stories, and was eventually released and got himself on a child transport, a kinder transport, first to London and then to the U.S., where he joined his younger brother who'd gotten out earlier, and then he went back to Germany, enlisted as a U.S. soldier at the end of the war as like a late teenager, and this is where he, quote, settled some old scores. I had to kind of fill in some gaps, but my own imagination as a child hearing about this kind of ran wild with this, of his kind of morally ambiguous arc going from victim to victor to vengeance taker / potential victimizer. And then the final third of the book is my sort of reckoning with this history that I'd engrossed, enmeshed myself so much in over the course of this project, where part of it's a travel log. I go back to Germany and Poland to family historical sites there, just to kind of see what I can experience, and that becomes part of the narrative, as well as the kind of contemporary historical events such as COVID happening during the writing of this, seeing historical echoes with my grandfather hiding in the infectious diseases ward in this particular image, as well as the Trump presidency and the culmination of the January 6th riot at the Capitol, and just seeing for myself, experiencing this feeling of past and present sort of merging, and the veil between those two time periods sort of becoming frayed. And then kind of ending on my own experience becoming a father during the pandemic and during this real time of upheaval, and thinking about how I can use the past, what I've learned, to try to help forge a better future, both for my family and, maybe for others outside of that situation. And I'll just kind of quickly go through a couple of the other images because we may talk about them later. Here's me drowning in ephemera as I'm collecting information for this book. Here's Grandpa Jack writing down his story in the late 80s. Never really talked about it much before here, but all of his murdered mother, grandmother, uncle, aunt, murdered in Auschwitz looming behind him. And there he is as a soldier in the army overseeing a group of SS POWs as a translator, and sort of, that morally ambiguous position he's been put in. And my Richter grandparents and the infection at the Mannheim Hospital after Kristallnacht, seeing all the damage wrought there. And then I think finally, yes, me metaphorically transforming into my aging family member obsessed with genealogy and the oppression of the Jewish people. And that takes us to the end of the general image lecture. So I'll give it to you.
Thanks, Ari. It's a great overview, brings the whole story to mind.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit up front about, just kind of stepping back from the details of the story, why was comics the way to tell this story?
Yeah, so my own history, I come from fine arts. I am a professor of fine arts. I have a whole education in the matter. And, comics for me was my inception point of creativity and of, really visual culture as a young person. As a child, I was obsessed with comics. This was my life. Up until some point in late high school, I decided I'm going to become a, quote, serious artist. I go on the fine arts track, and that became my life for a couple decades after. And it was really once I had the idea to tell my family story that I realized that my existing art practice was maybe a little too abstract to tell this story in a way that has the direct communication that was necessary for me to really get this information out there without any kind of ambiguity about what we're looking at, what we're talking about. So it became almost like a natural transition for me to use comics as that way of just telling this story in a direct narrative sense, and then reigniting that place full circle where creatively I came into the world of visual culture. So there was a lot of learning on the job. I was not a trained illustrator. I often see the skills and expectations of illustration and fine arts in a lot of ways being in opposition with each other. All art, as I see it, is about communication. You're communicating something, whereas visual, illustration arts, are about direct communication. You want those panel images to as directly as possible translate the text. Whereas with fine arts, the communication is always expected to be a little bit more abstract. It's usually more about communicating emotion or ideas, or even just direct obfuscation of the idea, so that people can kind of formulate their own opinions in their own minds. So I found myself butting up a lot, against those two expectations. And, maybe that's something that, even makes the book a little bit unique, is that, it does include, the directness as well as the abstraction, in different ways together.
Was there a part of the story that was harder to translate into this medium than other parts of the story? I mean, in that interplay between the directness of historical narration and storytelling and character, and that conceptual sense that you want people to have feelings and responses that are more, abstract and more their own.
Yeah, I found that the most difficult place to manage between the directness and the abstraction is where I had information and I lacked information. And I know that you want to talk about this as well in different contexts, but I had to fill in a lot of gaps in the narrative, stuff that where I just didn't have the direct, history there. Even though I had a lot of information to start with, there were a lot of gaps I had to fill in. So it was having to reconcile what is appropriate to fill in gap wise, and what is not appropriate to do that with. So, some of the stories I gave myself more permission to do so than others, just depending on what's happening in those narratives and whose stories I'm telling.
Yeah. So we can just go there. So there's a wonderful moment where your grandpa Carl is performing burials for these bodies that were sent. Do you want to tell that story? Because that was a story, I think, that had multiple versions in your family, and it was kind of hearsay, but you render that really quite strikingly. We don't have the image of this particular passage, but do you want to tell us about that?
Absolutely. So Grandpa Carl was kind of like this is a Grandpa Carl, and from the back of his experience. So when his community in Mannheim was essentially destroyed, and then all the Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, he actually, I didn't say this earlier on, he was not arrested by the simple clerical error that they populated these lists of who to arrest a full year in advance of Kristallnacht, and he and his family had moved to that congregation 10 months before. So within that 2-month period was the grace period of him not being arrested. That's why they had to keep just hiding him different places. But he was able to stay behind with essentially the congregation of women and children at that point, and just do what he could to keep that community together, including the funeral services for all the remains that were being sent back from the various camps. And so there's this story where he told his story so many times in his lifetime. It was such a crystallized version of the event. But there was one story that never really made it into his various tellings, but everyone in my family has some version of, which is that one of the days that remains were being sent back to Mannheim, that he was burying the remains, he was always told never open the caskets by the Nazi authorities. And there was always a minder there, watching from the Nazi party, just watching and making sure that he's complying. And at some point he was alone with the coffin, and bereaved, I think the wife of the man sent back in the coffin, just demanded to see her husband one last time. And he caved in, opened up the coffin, and apparently, allegedly, in that coffin was a SS officer in full regalia with a bullet in his head. And nobody, so he had to close it up. do the funeral as if nothing had happened. But again, there's no like official version of this story. And, so it was such like a kind of a juicy detail though, in the family narrative that I wanted to illustrate that, but I had to make very clear, like in the footnotes, like this is a, like a remembered version of somebody's memory that, is not actually documented in any other way. But I gave myself, a lot of permission in that, in that page to just tell that story. I had an aesthetic in mind. I was thinking about like these old pre-code comics, like Tales from the Crypt, he's like, like sound effects, like creaking opening the coffin, and then like the terrified views on their faces with like, lighting that, from below. So, but I really just want to play with that because, it was such a striking story and a striking image, even though I had no, I had no way to confirm the historical accuracy of that.
Yeah. What I love about the way you just told that story is that you turn to another genre to help you sort of structure the imagination of that moment. Tales of the Crypt. It's so interesting how the layers of cultural formation kind of hold up and become a substrate of the narrative. And I was really interested in this moment because I've read a lot of Holocaust narratives. I have never seen that element, and it's very interesting at this sort of late date in the proliferation of stories of this time that you can have truly new details emerge. And it just, for me, demonstrates why, or one reason why, it's really important to keep looking into the archives, keep hearing the stories, because there is a greater history that is always coming to the surface. And it challenges things that can become generic about Holocaust narrative. And I think one of the sort of cultural challenges in seeing new work in this genre come out is that it can feel like we've heard this story before. And so what's really fresh about your work, I think, is not only that it includes moments like that, but that there is this very particular version of the story that your family embodies that's really quite unusual. But let's talk about humor as part of the genre of comics, because in early times, I remember the film Life is Beautiful, which uses a kind of comic structure to tell a Holocaust story, and that was very controversial at the time. When Mouse first came out, there was real controversy about telling a Holocaust story in a genre that was attached so powerfully to humor. And I just want to say I was with a great scholar of American Jewish literature over the weekend, or just yesterday, and I brought Ari's book out and I was showing it to him, and people were laughing at the title, "Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz," and I was like, "Oh my, are we allowed to laugh at this? Are we not?" So can you talk about humor and how you manage it and use it?
Yeah. So, and, I think it's an important thing to bring up because when I do like an overview lecture of this, it's often so focused on the events that, that happen in the family history that are all the, the very serious and tragic part of this, that it's hard to see the humorous lens, but it's very much there. And it's inseparable from the way that I process this history. It's like I have a very darkly sardonic sense of humor, and it wouldn't have been natural for me to write a completely, straight-faced accounting of this history because it's through my generational perspective. I think a lot of this has to do with generational change. I think that it's actually very interesting that you bring up Life is Beautiful, Roberto Benigni's Holocaust movie that swept the Oscars in the mid-90s. I actually just a couple of weeks ago published a piece in Hyperallergic, a graphic essay about Jerry Lewis's lost Holocaust movie, The Day the Clown Cried, from 1972, which was filmed and then for a lot of complicated reasons never like edited and distributed. And one of those reasons is because like the critical reception essentially from people who were just like even just vaguely aware of this was so like terrified. Like people like the fact that this comedian would be approaching the subject of the Holocaust with any semblance of humor. It's about a clown who is interned in a concentration camp and then leads children into the gas chamber at Auschwitz. It's a horrible story, but the fact that it was made only a quarter century after the events that it depicts in a fictional sense, and then Life is Beautiful another quarter century later literally sweeps the Oscars, and then here we are another quarter century later with our current timeline. It's like works of culture like that created the foundation on which this book could exist, that it can contain the multitudes of, you know, the seriousness, the trauma, as well as the humor of just, you know, using humor in my case mostly to process that history and to process that trauma. So it's humor is a, you know, deeply personal thing for me, but it's also a very real, you know, tool that I use.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think we should go back. Let's look at the I want to think about style and the collage, because I think it segues quite well on the humor. One of my favorite images in this book is this one. It's almost hard for me to put into words why I find it so delightful and so funny. But can you talk a little bit about both collage as a technique? I mean, you're a fine artist, that's a technique that you use otherwise, but also the particular way you organize this page and the way you put this together, and just help us to appreciate its complexity.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, personally, collage is something that's always been a center of my art practice. Like, I mean, ever since I was really a kid, so my earliest memories of art making are gluing, like I lived in, you know, Florida. I would like find worms like that would dry to the sidewalk in the heat, and I would like peel them off the cement and then collage them onto paper. And that was like literally some of the earliest art making that I have memory of making. But collage has always been a central part of my art practice because, you know, like I'm not above, you know, like tracing and using other people's, you know, like, you know, other images to incorporate in, because it's taking culture and inspiration from here and there. So for this particular collage, it's a 2-page spread in the book, and I had probably some of the most fun making this, as you know, from anything in the book, because it was just a way of me sitting down and saying, okay, what were some of these like Jewish luminaries in my childhood when I'm sitting there listening to Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song on my headphones and, you know, like reading some of my, you know, favorite comics, you know, like what were some of these influences swirling in my imagination? And I really had to curate this. I mean, like I spent a lot of time, more than, you know, it's probably necessary to like make this image, but thinking about who were these kind of cultural representatives of where I was in this, you know, like 1990s sort of, you know, mindset for myself, and then thinking about where that transitions into my own parents' mindset, you know, as coming of age in the, you know, 1950s, 60s, etc. And then where they merge. So like, for instance, like probably one of my first introductions into comics, into the world of comics, was Mad Magazine, you know, at least in its magazine state, not technically a comic, but, you know, go with me on this, which my father introduced me to because he grew up on that. And that was really his introduction into kind of like American counterculture, as it was for many in his generation. And so that's why we have Alfred E. Neuman himself, you know, like straddling the seam of those 2 pages. So kind of a quasi version of the Mad Fold-In, you know, where his face is sort of in between those pages. And then, you know, fanning out from there. So, you know, we have like, you know, Stan Lee on one side and then, you know, Simon and Garfunkel on the other side. And, you know, so it really trying to find those places where those cultures merge. But really the main goal of this to thinking about, you know, Jewish American assimilation and what that represented for me, for my parents, and, you know, essentially this generation or two of Jewish Americans.
Yeah, no, it's glorious. Collage seems to me one version of collaborative art making. In that sense, it's sort of, you know, as you say, kind of opening your arms and gathering in popular culture and the makers and creatives of the past into your present practice. But let's talk about collaboration a little more broadly. This was a very collaborative work, as I understand it. You told a little bit of the story about the Leo Baeck Institute. Can you fill that out a little bit? And then also I want to think about collaboration with your family. But let's start with the archive.
Yeah. So with the archive in particular, so I mean, with Leo Baeck, it was such a, I mean, I couldn't have made parts of this book without that collaboration. Essentially, what I did was I reached out, I had my great-grandfather's manuscript. So he had written in German his, like, you know, this testimony of his experience in Kristallnacht and Buchenwald. And then he did that first, and then he expanded it into a full life memoir, which I had like a translation of like the little 3-page German testimony of that narrow piece. And I just had then this huge 177-page tome of a autobiography, all typewritten in German, that I did not have access to, which I then donated to Leo Baeck. I was working with Michael Simonson, who wonderfully collaborated, and I donated the manuscript to them. And then he assigned one of their translators, Yves Hecht, who essentially translated this entire memoir for me so I could see what was in it, which became part of the narrative of the book. But I would get these little like weekly drops of maybe like 10 pages at a time, which was like it was like the most exciting thing for me that week, to open up my mailbox and like scour through like what just like random thing, you know, was happening in my great-grandfather's life at that particular moment. And so there was a lot of that, you know, in that same realm. Part of the project of this book, beyond just illustrating my family's experience, was finding a home for some of this ephemera that I had. Like my family are collectors, maybe hoarders. I certainly have this impulse myself. You know, I think there is a relationship there to, you know, processing of trauma and, you know, holding on to these experiences and, you know, the physicality of things and what they play in that role. But I have a lot of stuff, and that drowning in ephemera is like a real feeling. And I also am not, you know, like there was like when I was writing the book, like a recent flood in my art studio basement of my home in Queens, where, you know, like I was like, oh my God, I'm going to like lose all this stuff that I have, you know, from the family archives. So part of the project has been finding other institutions to partner with to donate this stuff to, because like, I know I'm not the best person to hold on to it. So that's like the archives piece. The family collaboration, I always talk about the book as an intergenerational collaboration. Even though, you know, many of the subjects are no longer living, you know, I have the documentation of their lives. I have the ones who left their stories. I have those documents. I have the living family members, my parents and my aunts and uncles, and, you know, the people who I can tap to get their versions of these stories. But it was very much a collaboration. Like they were all, you know, thankfully on board from day one to help out however they could. And, you know, in some cases I had to make judgment calls for sure. It's like, you know, Aunt X, you know, has one version of these events. My dad has another version of these events. My grandfather wrote yet a different version of these events. So, you know, I either, you know, find the in-between state, or I just make up, you know, my own version of this, annotate where I have to. That's something, you know, some sort of translation was happening here. But I absolutely see it as a collaboration through the generations. And you know, part of that is the generational trust of knowing that they wanted these stories told, you know, that this was important for them. They left the stories in written form or recorded form, and that it was very important for them. So, you know, it's either, you know, like I take up that mantle of keeping their story told, or I let it, you know, either, you know, languish in some archive somewhere or disappear completely. And that was the choice I at least gave myself.
Was there anything, when you sort of reflect on the materials that you used, was there anything that you really, really wanted to put in here that didn't quite make it?
That's a
I should
great
have asked
question.
You that
Yeah, no,
so
that's.
that you could think
I
about
mean,
it, but...
so much got left on the cutting room floor,
Yeah,
as it
sure,
were.
yeah.
I mean, there were just so many like dead ends or things that like I felt were interesting but did really nothing for the narrative. I'm trying to think about something specific that actually, you know, served that, you know, that sort of serves that purpose. You know, a lot of it also just comes down to my own narrative experience, because I'm processing this whole thing as it's happening, and like as I'm like experiencing this stuff, it's like part of it too is just kind of like making that editorial decision to kind of quiet my own narrative voice and let my grandparents and great grandparents speak. And I think that's my answer, is that like what I had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor is my own annotations and interpretations of what they went through, because in a lot of ways it's much more interesting to let these people speak for themselves, to let my grandparents and great grandparents actually speak for themselves, and not just have, well, actually, in my interjection, because it's like my voice is interesting, I think, but it's certainly not as interesting as hearing their stories directly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, back to that question of why the comics form works and what's resistant about it versus what's really helpful about it. I mean, it seems to me, in the way that you can segment out voices, both stylistically and then formally in the frame, it does actually allow you to really separate out your interpretive voice or your commentating voice. And there isn't much of it, but you really do see it popping up here and there in a footnote or a little, part of the panel.
Absolutely. And so like something I didn't really I think we mentioned just a little bit earlier, is that each of the ancestor chapters, where I have them directly narrating their experience, I use different like narration aesthetics to show where we are. So there's a real round robin that's happening narratively, which I was always a little bit afraid to start with. Am I going to just lose the reader? They're seeing all these different like text styles and narration styles. Is it going to lose them? But I think it actually does like hold together at the end. But yeah, by giving each of those different narration styles, so like my Richter grandparents, Grandpa Carl, the rabbi, like, his is this closed captioning aesthetic, because he's told his story so many times. He was interviewed by the Steven Spielberg's USC Shoah Foundation, where I take a lot of his direct telling from, even though I have multiple interviews. I sort of like aesthetically base it and take a lot of the narrative from that particular telling. But so there's like, that aesthetic. There's my Grandpa Jack's like dot matrix printer, self-published memoir aesthetic from the late 90s. There's my great-grandfather Richard May's typewritten onion skin aesthetic as well. But yeah, so each of those shows, signifies this is this voice. And then you have the little narration text, like you can see in this panel, or the little annotation text with the footnotes and the yellow, where I'm just like, that's my voice. It's just clearly like I can say, like, maybe this happened this way, but Wikipedia says otherwise, or whatever the whatever that narration needs to be.
Yeah, and it does it so elegantly, and so it's just very easy to do that in this form. Let's talk a little bit about the moral ambiguity of Uncle Jack.
Yeah, Grandpa Jack. Yeah, sure.
And just how you deal with the moral ambiguity as it figures in this story. And then maybe we can talk too about the moral texture of modern Germany that you also talk about in the story.
Yeah, so Grandpa Jack's story was, I think it's one of the more narratively compelling of the ancestor stories, because of that ambiguity that you described, that moral ambiguity, where again his story is this teenage teenager who's interned in Dachau, who then makes it out on a kinder transport and then is enlisted in the U.S. Army, goes back and fights near the end of the war, and mostly serves as an interpreter of a group of Nazi and SS POWs that he oversees. And the real either direct abuses of power that are evident in that situation, but also the implied abuses of power. So, in his memoir, he talks about having been awarded a furlough after the war ended to go back to his hometown of Alsens in Rhineland-Pfalz, southwestern Germany, and I quote, settle some old scores, which he never really gets into. He describes a couple sort of like frat house prankster style things, like like taking like jewels and gold that he finds in someone's basement that he's like, quote, sure were stolen from Jewish people in the community, and throwing it in the Danube, and like doing like an SS, like a Gestapo style storming of the home of somebody from the Nazi women's auxiliary who he was sure had like stolen his family's like silver collection, or these kind of things, which were like clearly bad, but also not quite war crimes level bad as we think about these in these contexts. But I got to have, because all the story wasn't there. I mean, I think he just didn't want to like incriminate himself if there was anything else that he did that was beyond those things I described. But I got to kind of like imagine these things for myself. And, there's like images where I think about, like my imagination. You see like the thought bubbles version here, my imagination of his experience, going from victim to, victor to victimizer or vengeance taker. And, like I have to come to terms with my own, like moral ambiguity in the system as somebody who's like taking some amount of like schadenfreude or some amount of titillation at the very least from the possibilities of that violence. And it doesn't make me feel great to to feel these things, but it's very real. And to your point about to your question about contemporary Germany, I go there in my in the contemporary chapters of the book, in some traveling, and honestly I was like very taken aback by the culture of remembrance that exists there. So that's been fostered over the last couple generations. Definitely the wartime generation after the war was not exactly there. It was actually, and I talk about this in the book, that very ironically there was like a educational reprogramming campaign that was very much led by the occupying U.S. forces in the U.S. district in Germany at the time, and as was the reparations program that my grandparents directly benefited from, from lost income, essentially from their careers that they were denied as a rabbi and a baker, respectively, in Germany. And so I think about that. I think about that a lot, and like the real, like where these histories butt up against each other, and the thinking about how these reparations programs, for instance, could be a direct blueprint for I don't know, we don't want to talk about this as well here, of like for instance the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in this country, which I get into in the book, because it's always just said that it just wouldn't be logistically possible, but there's like literally this blueprint that it was thought to be impossible in post-war Germany, yet it exists, and my grandparents benefited from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible in your generation, or our generation, if I can say that, to talk about the victims of this terrible, passage of history, not only in the sort of saintly terms
Mm-hmm.
of victim only, and not complex human person. And I think that's what you do in Jack's narrative. You let us see that. I mean, it would be interesting to think about whether that complexity is possible in the German context today. And we don't need to get into that, but it's just like an open question. I don't know
the German mind, but
I know it's an interesting.
But it's, I mean, but to your point, it's like it's important that narratives of the Holocaust that are made today, that they allow for that moral complex state and that moral ambiguity, because we're talking about full human beings. These are not just saintly victims. Like if we relegate the stories of the Holocaust to just these were perfect people who were put in horrible circumstances, nobody grows, nobody learns from that, because it actually does the opposite of humanizing. It's dehumanizing.
Yeah. I just want to drop a sort of lead for future thinking, but the way that popular culture informs your work and the way you're telling these historical stories, it strikes me that there's a lot in common with someone like Colson Whitehead, who, great novelist of the African American experience, very interested in popular culture. He writes a zombie novel because he was so interested in sort of B-grade horror movies. So there's a way that kind of lowbrow popular culture has really played a role in high art rethinking of the past
Yeah.
in this generation. I think it's really fascinating.
Or the 2 minutes here.
Yeah,
but,
I
and
see
I guess
that.
and, similarly, there's the Jordan Peele produced
Yes.
Hunters
Yes,
series
yes,
on
yeah. Yep.
was it on Amazon? I think it's no longer
Yep.
running, but yeah, this kind of which is also similar to from a different perspective, not from the African American diaspora perspective, but you have Inglourious Basterds, Quentin Tarantino's Holocaust, romp, which is like these. But I'm also like wary of these kind of narratives that are just these like vengeance narratives, because whereas like I felt when I first watched Inglourious Basterds, I actually felt this like this feeling like yeah, we got ours, we got ours, but it's like it's like not like a great feeling to dwell in, just in that violence, taking something back narrative.
Yeah, I'm going to ask one more question before we allow you all to ask your questions. Just to that sense of, looking to both acknowledge the complexity of humanity, but also think about how can a story make the world better. Part of the last section is dwelling on Tikkun Olam, and there's the great Tikkun Olamometer that measures how well you're doing.
Right.
So that part is very fun. But I'm also noting that in the course of writing this, you became a father. This story is very much about fathers and sons and grandsons. You became the father of a daughter, and now you have 2 daughters. Tell us a little bit about kind of making the world better, looking towards the future, those gendered pieces. If you can just dwell a little bit on those things.
I mean, one of the things that I was absolutely just, the entire time I was making this book, I wish that I had more of the perspective of the women in my family. I had some documentation, but for the most part, because of the patriarchy at the time, because of just who happened to be the storytellers, I have a story of, great-grandfather, grandfather, myself telling these stories. But of course, thinking about the future that I want to see, especially for my daughters, especially in this current administration, which, there's almost like an embarrassment for me that I like on the back of the book jacket, for the text, I have like, it's a story that spans 4 generations from pre-war Germany to post-Trump America. And, it's like I wrote that in a very wishful thinking way, that a story that ended in 2022, essentially, the book had to be published and, made, but it's, it's like now that I'm thinking about a world where my daughters potentially don't have reproductive, freedoms, there's like a very real possibility that there could be a federal abortion ban, for instance. And I think about, what these stories in the past have to tell us, like what we can draw from them, because the past is never, as the saying goes, the past is never truly past. It lives in the current moment. It lives inside of us, and I, just doing what I can to try to push that narrative forward.
Thanks, Ari. So I'm happy to open it up, and Ari, you can choose who you would like to call on.
Sure, over here in the orange stripes. Yeah. Hi.
Sure. I've seen and also read a number of like intergenerational Holocaust memoirs. Specifically intergenerational graphic Holocaust memoirs. Like there's Mouse, there's Your Book, there's Flying Couch, there's others. And do you think, and something that I've seen and talked to people who are really into nonfiction comics about, is this concept that like having the author as a perspective character for the story, like an introduction to the story for nonfiction cartooning, is very common and works very well. And specifically for Holocaust nonfiction and intergenerational Holocaust nonfiction, do you think that that is an important piece to have that like perspective, because you need to be let into the world a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, there's such a tradition of it, as you're saying, from Spiegelman through Miriam Catton, who's one of my real, people that I look to inspirationally, and Amy Kurzweil, Flying Couch, Artificial. I mean, like, there's absolutely this strong tradition of this first-person autobiographical narrative perspective, but it's also just autobio comics are their own genre. It's not where Holocaust autobio intersects with the general autobiographical comics aesthetic. It's like, I mean, it's been there almost since the inception of at least underground comics and the graphic novel, which is what Spiegelman represents. But yeah, there's just something about the ability to enter into the conversation, into the space through someone's perspective, maybe generationally, someone's perspective that the current generation of readers can understand and acknowledge, is helpful. But I think just as a genre, autobio is just a wonderful way to see inside someone else's head to that experience, and a way of further humanizing whatever the experience happens to be. Yes, in the middle.
Could you talk about the order of events that you worked in? So you have the research piece.
Yeah.
Did you finish the research before doing the other part? And did you do pictures first, words first, together?
Great question, and I don't have like a concrete answer, because this is my first graphic novel. I was not even an illustrator coming into this in that sense. I was not a cartoonist until I became a cartoonist here. But I had to learn a lot about the process of cartooning and graphic memoir making. Like I didn't know, for instance, that like the script, the story of it really looks like a screenplay, and that's like what comics scripting is. So I had to be taught that, as a medium. But it came together in different parts. So the very first thing that I illustrated without even having the book in mind was my great-grandfather's Kristallnacht and Buchenwald narrative. So Richard May's narrative, I just had this like short, 3-page, typed German, testimony, and it is something I was always aware of, but just didn't never really gave a very deep consideration of. And I wanted to, in a way, visually kind of like exercise the demons of it that were in my imagination at that time in the post Tree of Life time. So I just decided, okay, comics is the way I'm going to do this. I mapped it out by, drawn panels. It was the only chapter in the book that I like hand drew. Almost everything else became digitally drawn. So as far as like penciling in that traditional way, and then I scanned it in, I realized I had to redraw it essentially to get it digitized. But then, after that point, I sort of started scripting it out. I learned about scripting, and I scripted out maybe 3/4 of the narrative. And part of this was, while doing research, and then left maybe 1/4 of the book as like to be determined as history was unfolding, which it did very much in the COVID and January 6th and all these other, and becoming a father, all these intersecting parts. But the research also happened as I was writing and illustrating it. So and things also changed dramatically in some cases from the written page to the illustrated panels, as it had different iterations throughout the process. Yes, in the front.
So, thank you very much for sharing your perspective on your humor. It was great to hear that you said that it's so dark and sardonic.
Oh yeah.
Because the humor really sits in the code of the book, right? The beginning and the end of the book, which is your story.
Yeah.
And a powerful trauma in that humor, especially in the collage that you showed us, for your generation and your parents' generation, was deracination here in America. And it has this really interesting moment in your story where you go and get your German passport.
Oh yeah.
Right? So it's almost as if you're saying, well, if I'm going to fight back against how I've been deracinated, let me go claim my heritage. But I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
To what extent did deracination exist for your ancestors before they start being victimized?
Okay, and just to clarify, can I get your definition of deracinization here, so make sure it's the same as mine that I have in my head?
Yeah, basically, your culture is being taken from you, and in your story, it's really powerful when you're young. When you're young, you're in school, and everybody's Brad.
Right. And and I don't know if it's as much the culture being taken away as it is an actively engaged assimilation, right? So it's surely by there's these cultural forces that are saying okay, but you're white, become a white American in these other ways, but there's a real desire there to become that thing. So whether it's a Stockholm syndrome or not is up to the interpretation of the reader, but it goes back to before America. I mean, it definitely goes back to Germany. It goes back to my my grandparents and my great-grandparents who were early adopters of, the Reform Judaism movement, where my grandfather was a rabbi, but also just this idea that they were Germans first and Jews by birth or by incident. I mean, that was really how they lived their life and saw themselves culturally. They all the men of my great-grandparents' generation fought in the First World War, for the first time that Jews were allowed to fight for Germany in a war. And they did it with valor and with purpose because it was their way of, quote, entering that, polite German society and getting into, really enmeshing into that. It was something that was for me, a foundational text that is in the bibliography I made for the book is Amos Elan's The Pity of It All, which is it's a history of the German Jewish experience, essentially from Moses Mendelssohn through the Weimar era. It really just ends before the start of the Holocaust. But it's really, I see it as almost like a story of a spurned lover. So it's this idea that there's this culture that's so in loved and enamored, and then is with the Jewish culture being so enamored with German culture, and that is the ultimate goal, and then seeing where they actually stand, and then so my in my contemporary narrative, I'm going through some of those same feelings, and so certainly reclaiming my German passport, which was a lot more about my ability to benefit from this, and as an academic I was okay, I know I can get this German passport as my uncle had done before me, and he's an academic and he used it to go travel around Europe and teach in institutions. Maybe I'll do the same thing, seeing as something that it's owed to me more than, whereas my cousin, who did the same reclaiming of citizenship and currently lives in Berlin with her 4 children and her family and is having a wonderful time as she sees it, she describes it, and as she puts in the book, that it's, for her, it's a homecoming because she never felt fully American, and that she'd only been in this country for a couple generations, our family, whereas our family in Germany on that side had been there for centuries in the rural southwestern region. And so for her, it was just coming back home.
I think we're at time. Stephanie, thank you so much. Ari, thank you. This was such a delightful conversation.
Thank you.
Such a rich work of art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you and to our panelists, of course. And don't forget to visit the book signing stand downstairs.